Good afternoon, grade 8. This is continuing on the reproductive system of the human, and we dealt with the structure of the male reproductive organs and the structure of sperm, and I hope that you all managed to calculate that magnification of the sperm cell. It's terribly important that if you get exercises to do with these lessons, that you do the exercises yourself before you get the memo. It doesn't help anybody, especially it doesn't help you. It doesn't matter to me in the least, but it's not going to help you if you wait until the memos arrive and then you copy the memos, either directly or indirectly. It's not going to help you. And you're the guys that have got to pass this year, not me. So make sure that you do all the work that you are told to do. Okay, so we're starting with the female reproductive system. And the female reproductive system is in fact much simpler in structure than the male reproductive system. In functioning, it's a little more complicated, but we'll get there. Okay, so in terms of structure. Now, if you look at these two diagrams, there is lots that is incorrect about the way in which they are labeled. And so I'm going to point all the problems out to you, and you must take cognizance of them. Remember, you would never do two diagrams side by side like this, because the labels have to be on the right side of the diagram, and there isn't enough room here. So the labels, remember, need to be one underneath each other on the right-hand side, which means that the label lines must be parallel to each other, and they must end on an imaginary pencil guideline. Then the label lines must never be at all these funny angles, and the labels all over the show, so I've covered that information. Also, the labels cannot begin with a capital letter unless it's a proper noun, and none of these are proper nouns. In addition, this is the common name for this particular structure. And so you're in grade 8 now, you've got to learn the correct scientific names for these things. So every now and again, I'm going to say to you something like, in the diagram, it is called an oviduct, but you have to call it a fallopian tube. And a fallopian tube is in fact a proper noun, and so you have to write it with a capital F. But let's just leave that and carry on learning about the structure of this thing. Okay, so this is a longitudinal section going down through the center of the body, and it's looking from the anterior view. So what you can see here is the two gonads of the female. Those gonads, each one is called an ovary. So it's a gonad because its function is to produce gametes, one of its functions. It actually also produces hormones, but we're not going to get into that yet. We will talk about that a little bit later on. So the function of an ovary is to produce egg cells or ova. In a human female, only one egg cell is released per month, and it is thought that the ovaries alternate. It appears that they do. So if this ovary produces an egg cell this month, then next month it will be that ovary, and the following month it will be this ovary. And so the little egg cell, once it matures, moves to the surface of the ovary and is released from the ovary, and that's a process called ovulation. And it passes down the fallopian tube. So remember, correct scientific term, fallopian tube. And if it is fertilized, it will then implant in the uterus. So we'll talk about that later on, okay? And that is where it will grow. The uterus is a very thick-walled muscular organ. I'll talk about that in more detail, and it is lined with a very spongy layer called an endometrium. This region of the uterus is called the cervix, or neck of the uterus, and that is a ring of circular muscle that is able to contract, and it is able to ensure that the opening is closed so that the developing embryo or fetus doesn't fall out of the uterus. Okay, then this is the vagina. The vagina is not as commonly thought, just the opening to the exterior. The vagina is in fact this thin-walled passage that connects the cervix to the opening to the exterior. Okay, this is the medial longitudinal section looking from the lateral view. And what you can see here is as follows. Sorry, guys. Sorry, I'm really struggling with the cough today, so I do apologize. Okay, so let's orientate relative to a whole lot of things. This is the end of the vertebral column. You possibly call it a spine. Not in my class, you don't. So it's the vertebral column. Okay, it's the end of the vertebral column. And at the front here, this is the cartilage. This blue part is the cartilage that connects the two pelvic bones, pubic bones, together in the front. And I'll show you that relative in another diagram just now. Let's have a look. Here is the urinary bladder in which urine is stored, and that opens to the exterior through this little tube here called the urethra. Here is the uterus. There's an ovary, there's a fallopian tube, and this is the uterus, and here's the cervix, and there's the vagina, and there's the external opening of the vagina. So this diagram is a bit confusing, the one on the left, because it appears this thing, the uterus is standing upright. But in reality, it actually lies on top of the bladder, which explains why when a female is pregnant and the uterus is busy expanding, she needs to go to the toilet to urinate far more often than normal, and that's because of the pressure on the bladder. And then directly behind the uterus and the vagina is the last part of the large intestine. So remember, the abdominal cavity is basically filled with small intestine and large intestine, and the end part of the large intestine is called the rectum. So this is the rectum, and this is where feces is stored until it's ready to be passed out through the anus when the individual defecates. Okay. This shows exactly the same, except that it's got three other little things labeled that we'll talk about. These three down here. The first is a little patch of erectile tissue that is equivalent to a penis in a male, and it's a clitoris in a female. Clitoris or clitoris. Doesn't matter how you pronounce it, really. And this becomes swollen with blood during sexual arousal, just as a penis does. And then on either side of the vaginal opening, there are two lip-like structures. Labium actually means lips, and so the inner pair is the minor lips, and the outer pair is the major lips. So they are bigger and outer to the minor lips. Okay. This picture simply puts it into perspective relative to the pelvic girdle. So this is a hip bone, and this is a hip bone. And in the front here, this is the pubic bone, and the two pubic bones join in the middle, and that's the little blue part that I showed you over here. Right. In more detail. Sorry. Okay, so there's an ovary, there's an ovary. The ovaries are the female gonads because they produce the female gametes or sex cells, and those female gametes or sex cells are called the egg cells or the ovum. So let's presume an ovum is going to be released from this ovary this month. Okay, I'll go back to that. Fallopian tubes are where fertilization can take place when the egg cells are released from the ovary. I'll talk about that. The uterus is a hollow muscular organ. It's the site for the development of the embryo and the fetus during pregnancy. And then the vagina is an elastic muscular canal that connects the uterus to the exterior. Don't forget about the cervix over here. Eh? All right. So, fallopian tube, note how it's spelled. Note that it's written with a capital letter. Now, the fallopian tube is lined with cells that are covered with little hair-like structures called cilia. And what happens is when the egg cell is moved along the fallopian tube, it's the cilia that move it along the fallopian tube. They move almost like crowd surfing. They move the little egg cell along by wafting. Okay, so let's presume that this female releases an egg cell this month on this ovary. Okay, and that little egg cell then passes into the fallopian tube, and it's moved down the fallopian tube and it goes to the uterus. If the egg cell is not fertilized, then it'll just disintegrate. In fact, it's busy deteriorating as it passes down the fallopian tube. Egg cells don't last very long at all. If, however, it is fertilized, then it is normally fertilized when it's in this first little part here. So as it's passing down the fallopian tube, if a male has ejaculated into the vagina and semen has passed up through the cervix, through the uterus, some of it's gone that way, but some of it's gone this way. And so a sperm cell, let's say, manages to reach the egg cell and fuses with the egg cell, then that egg cell is called, it's called a zygote. It's no longer called an egg cell. So an egg cell that is fused with the sperm cell is called a zygote. That little zygote continues to move down the fallopian tube, and as it is moved down the fallopian tube, it is busy dividing. As soon as it divides even the first time, it's no longer called a zygote, it's called an embryo, and it becomes 2 cells, 8 cells, 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, 16, 32, blah, 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 and it reaches the uterus. And when it reaches the uterus, it implants itself. In other words, it embeds itself deeply in the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus. And there it will stay for the 9 months of pregnancy. Okay, so the ovaries are small. They're about 32 millimeters long. So pick up your ruler and have a look at 32 millimeters, 3.2 centimeters. It's not very long at all. And about 18 millimeters wide. They're oval-shaped glands. They're often referred to as being almond-shaped. You know what an almond looks like. And they're located on either side of the uterus. The ovaries are the gonads because they produce an ovum or an egg cell per month. The ovaries normally alternate and they take it in turns to produce 1 egg cell per month. In addition to that, they also produce 2 hormones that are essential in the reproductive process. And those hormones are estrogen and progesterone. We'll get back to those later on, and we'll talk about them in more detail. Estrogen, please note how to spell it. We use UK spelling, and estrogen is spelled with an O-E-S. In the United States, they just say estrogen, and there isn't an O on it. And so while I'm about it, let's talk about embryo and fetus. Fetus in UK spelling is F-O-E-T-U-S. In the United States, they spell it F-E-T-U-S, and you won't get it marked right if you spell it that way. Let's talk about the difference between an embryo and a fetus. So it is called an embryo for about the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. After about 8 weeks, when it starts to become recognizable as a human, then it is called a fetus. Okay. However, the absolute definitive period between an embryo and a fetus is a little bit blurred, and so sometimes people will call it an embryo right up until birth. Okay. All right. The fallopian tubes are very, very, very narrow tubes that lead into the upper part of the uterus. They enable the egg cells or ova, which are produced in the ovaries, to travel from the ovaries to the uterus. The cilia on the cells lining the tubes move that egg or embryo down the tubes to the uterus. If the egg cell is fertilized and In other words, conception occurs or the female becomes pregnant. If the egg cell is fertilized by a sperm cell, then it normally occurs as the egg is passing down the fallopian tubes. And remember, I said to you, it normally occurs actually quite early on in, well, not early on, quite close towards the actual ovary. Okay, so the uterus. The uterus is a hollow muscular organ in which an embryo can develop. It's about 7.5 centimeters long. So pick up your ruler and have a look at it, 7.5 centimeters. The lining of the uterus is a very spongy layer called an endometrium, and that's going to be important. The neck of the uterus, the cervix, allows sperm to enter, menstrual blood to exit, and it holds the developing embryo or fetus in the uterus during pregnancy. The vagina is a canal that joins the cervix, which is the lowest part of the uterus, to the outside of the body. It is lined with mucus-secreting cells that secrete lubricating mucus. It's able to stretch during the process of birth. And during sexual intercourse, semen containing sperm is deposited in the vagina. Let's just have a look at the spelling of this word mucus. There are two spellings of the word mucus. M-U-C-U-S is a noun. So if you talk about that slimy stuff in your nose, it is mucus, M-U-C-U-S. But if you use it as an adjective and you talk about mucus-secreting cells or mucus-secreting glands, then it's M-U-C-O-U-S because it's an adjective. Okay. Now this talks about the process of producing egg cells. So let's talk about a young girl. Let's call her girl A. When girl A was an embryo in her mother's uterus, let's call her mother Lady X. Girl A, in that embryo, when she was an embryo, already had her ovaries, and the process of producing egg cells had already started in her ovaries while she was in an embryo in the uterus of the mother. So they start the process of development while a female is an embryo in her mother's uterus. And then they stop and they remain dormant until the girl reaches puberty and she begins her menstrual cycle. And at that stage of the game, she has a large number of cells that can potentially develop into egg cells. Approximately 40,000 to 2 million cells that have the potential to develop into egg cells, which is pretty scary. But in fact, during her lifetime, she probably only uses about 480 of those. And the rest of them just deteriorate from the time she starts puberty. Even though they're still within the ovaries, they already start to deteriorate. And so the older a woman gets before she falls pregnant, firstly, the fewer potential egg cells she has, so the less likely she is to fall pregnant. But secondly, the egg cells that are there have not kept well. They've deteriorated. And so a female that falls pregnant at, say, age 35 or older is more likely to produce a baby that has defects, like has extra chromosomes or has birth defects. So the older a woman is when she gets pregnant, the more likely she is to have a miscarriage before she gives birth or to have problems with the actual baby. Okay. All right, I think that's enough for today. I will carry on recording the rest of it. So I will start on ovulation for Friday's lesson. that are